we've actually introduced myself. I'm Davies. Really good to meet you. I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves and give an initial perspective of where they're coming from, what their experiences are in this sector. I'm going to start not at the immediately to the left, but I'm going to start with the patient first, as I think we always should. Lucy.
Hi, I'm Lucy Dixon. I have something called primary ciliary dyskinesia, and I am involved with the charity Primary Ciliary Dyskinesia PCD Support UK. And I come from a background of being a patient advocate, but also working sort of health research as well, in which health tech has been really, really important for the better and remote management of conditions like PCD, which have a very high treatment burden. So yes, thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Billy and work our way back.
I'm Billy. I'm co-founder of Owlstone Medical. We develop breath tests for early detection and precision medicine applications. We have commercial tests today in GI disease, chronic liver disease. We've finished trials, phase 2 trials in early detection of lung cancer. And then last year we won a $49 million contract from ABHI to extend that to multi-cancer early detection. One of the things that we've done, because we developed some of these technologies with more prevalent diseases, we run a biomarker discovery and validation service as well. So that's allowed us to work with academic partners, other partners in areas such as cystic fibrosis, looking at Pseudomonas infection, propionic acidemia, IPF with companies such as Boehringer. So trying to think about how you can develop diagnostics in rare disease, but trying to solve for some of the business model challenges there.
Okay. Thank you. Peter?
Thank you. I'm Peter Fish. I'm the CEO of Mendelian. My background is molecular genetics and clinical medicine. I've been involved in trying to use large data to speed up the diagnosis of rare diseases. Most of the data we use is electronic health record data. We have a class 1 medical device that allows us to deploy, or allows the NHS to deploy case finding algorithms into care. Most of our work historically has been into primary care. So that is the lens I'll talk from to that.
Thank you. Deborah.
Deborah Morris-Rosendhal. I'm a consultant clinical scientist and the director of the Clinical Genetics and Genomics Laboratory. We're based in the Royal Brompton Hospital, and we're part of one of the 7 GMSs across the country. We're part of the Southeast Genomic Medicine Service, and our laboratory is commissioned to deliver specialist cardiac and respiratory testing. And we do quite a lot of research as well, trying to implement and innovate and use the latest technologies to try and increase diagnostic yield and drive diagnostics, sort of genomic diagnostics forward.
Great, thanks everybody. So what we're going to do is start off with is get the problems out of the way. So we'll do a bit of a session on, okay, what are the issues, and then hopefully we can move into something more positive and solution focused. So quick question we'll go around the panel, we'll go this way this time. Biggest challenges right now, biggest barriers to access to care and diagnostics for rare diseases. Deborah.
Yeah, I think I'm going to talk from a practical perspective of delivering genomic diagnostics, and I would really say one of the biggest stumbling blocks that crosses all aspects of a genomic diagnostic test is IT infrastructure and computing, and particularly in the NHS. I'll probably stop there and then we'll come back to that eventually. And that's from ordering a test to a clinician getting the test results, how the reports are delivered, and then obviously everything in between with how we analyze genomic data and do that.
Okay.
Peter, I think mine's actually fairly similar. We consider the disease diagnostic odyssey to be a data problem. And it's data at all levels, the patient data, the clinical picture, and how much rich information can you capture in a usable format. The actual rare disease information is what's known about those diseases, and can we land that at the right time to help diagnose. It's pointless educating every clinician about every rare disease because they're not using that information at the time. So can you land that information at the right time across all those spectrums, patient data, actual rare disease information, and then clinical knowledge. Correct.
So from the patient perspective, please don't hate me for this, I think part of the problem is primary care, and for various reasons. To give a bit of background, PCD causes repeat respiratory infections, sinus infections, ear infections. Children are typically born at term but go into respiratory distress quite soon after birth and have recurrent infections throughout the year. anyone here with children know that they are just, full of colds all year round. And so we know that about 37% of people with PCD go to their GP over 40 times before being referred for a diagnosis. And that most people with PCD see over 50 physicians before fully getting their diagnosis of PCD. And I think part of it is the infrastructure, the limited appointment times, lack of consistency, but also to the previous talk, the variability of a condition in which you might go to the doctor one day sounding in a certain way and another day being completely different. So it's very tricky.
So diagnostic odyssey is one part of the problem that we see, but after you've been diagnosed as well, how do you start thinking about using tests for monitoring if you're on treatment, looking at treatment efficacy, if you're looking for complications, etc. And there, I think you need to start thinking about different types of modalities as well, because some of the elements that were picked up in the last talk are very relevant. It needs to be very low cost, very accessible. Ideally, you want to be doing some of these tests in a home-based setting rather than coming into the clinic. So I think about not just that initial diagnostic odyssey, but what happens next and what can we do there.
Great, thanks all. We'll be coming back to a number of those themes as we go through this, I'm sure. But first of all, I want to go back to Lucy and unpack this bit more about the pathway that you're experiencing as a patient, and then perhaps to Deborah to get a clinician view on that. We'll see how similar or dissimilar they are. Lucy, tell us a bit more about that whole journey. I was surprised, I think it was Lawrence put up this morning at 5.6 years to get diagnosed, and you're talking about 50 visits.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Actually, now in the UK, the average age of diagnosis for PCD is about 4.5 years old. And actually, that's thanks to sort of services like that Debbie runs. And we've got 3 specialist diagnostic centres in England now, 4 treatment centres. But it is very difficult because of the symptoms that I have explained already. It means that people are consistently being treated in primary care, sometimes for too long before it's picked up, and then often they're misdiagnosed as asthma, or sometimes you have people that are diagnosed with bronchiectasis, which is a much bigger overarching disease, and then later it's realised that they have PCD. Testing for PCD is very complicated, and I'm actually going to let Debbie explain that in a bit better detail. But from a patient perspective, I see loads of families where they've had to have repeat testing. There is a disconnect between whether to do genetic testing or the more traditional testing, which plot twist, now we say you should do both, but it can take a really long time. And we have patients that are in their 50s being diagnosed, as well as newborns. What we want to see is everybody is diagnosed from birth. And we know with the new kind of the infant screening that's going on at the moment, that's going to become more likely.
So the main block of you're seeing is at that early stage of identification, of diagnostics. And you talk about primary care, where should that be happening? Where would it be best to happen? Is it primary care, because that's your first contact, but have they got the expertise? Community diagnostic centres, secondary care?
I rely on primary care to survive, and I'm not bashing that at all. I think if every child that was born at full term that went into respiratory distress straight after birth was immediately screened for PCD, you'd pick up a load of people immediately there. I think it's difficult because even then, when you get to secondary care, a lot of people are managed in local, in DGHs, and a lot of treatments. I was having this conversation earlier. A lot of treatments for PCD is, long-term antibiotics, and that can kind of bed things down a bit. It can help control the symptoms. So I think one of the problems is that actually we don't have anyone that's gathering all this information together at one point, looking at it as a big picture. And very quickly, I have a son who's about to turn 2. We know I have PCD. We are now seeing whether he has PCD. It's very unlikely, but it has taken us 2 years to even get to this point. And now when I go to a GP, I come with a crib sheet that says, these are the headline information. And I do think that for patients, their first point of access is usually primary care.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of management, things like detection of infection stuff, that's where I'd like to see tech focusing in the future. But if you don't identify patients, you're not getting to the point where you're picking up their infections and teaching them how to manage it.
Thanks.
Jump in before you. Yours is the downstream genetic. But our technology, of course, works in the primary care setting, looking for these patterns. We bring the information together longitudinally to expose these patterns up to the primary care physicians and empower them with the information as to what they'll do next with that information and the patient. So that is definitely the problem that we are trying to solve. It's primary care in this country is a brilliant place to find longitudinal records of patients, watch their progression, but every encounter is 7 minutes or so, and there's no way of looking back or bringing in all of that information together. So this is what we run in parallel. So we run this asynchronously. So we'll run programs to find these patients at scale and push them forward for testing down into the genetic test.
Yeah. No, I'm not a clinician, but I'm sure there are many clinicians in the audience who may want to ask questions or comment afterwards. But one of the things I think which should be relatively easy to solve and would help in the primary care is simply education and training. So there's not enough either rare disease information or genetics, I think, in the medical curricula as they stand at the moment. And I think that a lot of the problem in the primary care is the recognition of a rare disease and knowing about where to then refer the patient, the possibility of a rare disease, and also just in genetics training, being able to understand genetic disorders, realize who should be tested, who shouldn't be tested, and being able to interpret genetic results. That's a massive problem where sometimes things fall down completely. So it's a lot about education and training, I think, in the medical.
And on that education training bit, are there published guidelines, standards, and are they being followed? Are clinicians aware of them? Are they being followed?
They should, but I think if you're not taught about them, you're not going to be looking for them. So I think there has to be much more awareness. And it'll also play into the diagnostic testing, because genomic testing is expensive. We all know that. So we want to be testing the right patients, and we have eligibility criteria for our tests, and clinicians do their best to adhere to them. But we need more than, they're sometimes quite broad. We need more than that to identify which patients are most likely to have a genetic cause and which aren't, which would increase efficiencies in the whole system, I think.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So data's come up a lot already. We're 50 minutes in already. Data's come up a lot. So what's the role of data in really driving innovation and change within this? Maybe start with Peter, and we'll go to Philly. And
this is a 4-day conversation. But so basically, from our approach at least, the richer and the more complete the data set, the more efficiency we can extract in the process of what we're doing. Because we work in the NHS, and actually, as anyone working into the NHS, it's very difficult to get access to unstructured data at scale. So you're often working with structured data. At least in primary care, you're working with quite a detailed ontology of terminology in structured data. But because of this, we end up sacrificing sensitivity, because specificity is more important in clinical practice. You can't flag 10,000 patients when you're looking for 3 patients. So the level of data and the access for data at scale across the NHS, we are routinely deploying on 10 million primary care patients, but we need the haystack to find these needles. So getting access at the right level, which is either regional or potentially national, is critically important, and getting access to the deep data that's useful. Jim Davies spoke about that earlier, but also then the clinical sign-off to be using that data for clinical care. It's deeply embedded in the NHS, but it's quite difficult to get that to work in practice from a privacy point of view.
Yeah.
I'll answer the question slightly differently. When we think about data in the context of our new diagnostic modalities and breadth, the problem is a lot of it doesn't exist. So if you think about rare disease, where you might not have a lot of patients that have a condition, how do you identify them to try and do biomarker discovery? But how do you know some of those potential biomarkers might work or will be significant in the broader context as well? So I think one of the things that we've had to do is kind of brute force that. So working with academic groups, pharma companies across a lot of different studies to try and build a unique data repository. We call it a volatile atlas. So essentially, what's on breadth, what do the normal ranges look like? And that turns out to be very valuable when you look at rare disease, because if we then do a study like we did in propionic acidemia, you can take the small subset of patients who are part of that study where something's been identified to say, actually, we believe some of these biomarkers are going to be performant within a broad population without having too many false positives and false negatives. So a bit different in our case, we've had to go and create data where it hadn't existed before.
Okay. And Lucy and Deborah, it'd be interested in your views on, you come in from the not the tech perspective as such, although Lucy, I know you have some battle scars there. But integrating this into a pathway so it really impacts the patient journey and the outcomes, hopefully. Where do you see that working, and how does things need to change?
So from my experience having PCD, it's like being there's no stability at all, and so you're in these cycles where you get. I had 9 pneumonias last year, and I've had 4 or 5 courses of IV antibiotics in the past 12 months, and each time I think, I should have known I felt like this, 2 weeks ago. And so I think there is so much scope for managing conditions like mine, where you only see a specialist once a year, maybe twice a year, and you need patient input into developing these products. But in our experience, in my experience, we tried to develop a product. Patients told us that they wanted to better manage their condition remotely, and what we found is we thought we developed an app and a wearable tool that would help them kind of be able to pick up on exacerbations. But actually, just getting PCD patients to sign up to that and to use that tool so that we could do the trial was a nightmare, because we're doing 3.5 hours of care a day, and so we didn't quite get it right. And I think we've got to be building these products in tandem with patients, but really understanding, is there scope and is there a place for those patients to use that as part of their ongoing daily life? Does it fit in? I think that's a thing that is such a waste of resource if we can't make it fit into people's lives.
Okay, let's keep going. Deborah, your thoughts?
I think one of the points Lucy touched on is actually identifying patients who have been diagnosed with a rare disease like PCD as well. And there, I think the genomic laboratories could play such a role with having databases, having, they know which patients, and this is going to become more and more important with new therapies being discovered and developed that target specific genes, specific variants. We have that information, and we can try and alert patients, signpost them to new therapies, to clinical trials, to new diagnostic, applications or anything that may be useful for their care going down the line. And at the moment, I don't think there's any sort of consenting or anything in place to actually enable us or facilitate us to do that. And that should be done right at the very beginning of the process. We should know that if we come up with a diagnosis for this patient, we can then go back to them. We can go to their clinician, and we can follow a very long pathway to doing that. But I think there could be much more interaction with the laboratories doing the diagnostics and saying, yes, this may be relevant for all these patients, and how do we go back and contact them and enable them to participate in whatever's there. Yeah.
So you say you've got all this data. How is it being used at the moment, or is it not because it's not consented?
I think it's a lot of it is used for research if it's anonymized and made available, but ethically approved, obviously. But I think there's some missing links between electronic patient records and being able to go back and use genetic data in particular.
So it's being used in the aggregate, anonymized for research, but not for direct patient care. Sorry, Lucy, did you want to say?
I was going to say, as a patient, I sign pretty much anything that says, can we use it for research? But the connection between whether you get it back, whether you know what that has shown, is really, really poor. Even despite efforts like NIH will be part of research, it's just not there yet. And I think actually patients don't really know what they've signed up to, and there needs to be some way of seeing that a lot better. You're going to tell me you've got a solution to this?
No. I think there's a missing part here, and it's not the data. It's the who has the clinical decision making, and the labs they are not the clinical decision maker. They need to take the data and analyze the data and return that back with the question they've been asked by the clinical decision maker. But that clinical decision maker varies over time. They disappear, patients move around, And ultimately, there needs to be, or I think there needs to be, a shift in that clinical decision-making power to a higher, more regional body that then can ask the genetics labs to say, let's reanalyze these patients with this particular phenotype that we know historically our test actually missed these 12 diseases. This is a common problem, by the way. And but we never ever, very seldom do we reanalyze genetic data into the new things, and that could be hugely beneficial for that group of patients who have a suspected rare disease versus the unsuspected rare disease, which is pretty good to separate. But that clinical decision-making legal right is a problem with the way that we have structured the silos of data, because the data doesn't sit in the right place or at the right scale.
Okay. So I'm going to go off piece now. We didn't prepare this, but so we can move the data up to a higher level. Is there something about also giving the data to the patient so they can move it around to whatever clinician they're seeing? I don't know whether that's one for you, Peter, or Lucy, or, well, anyone, please.
Another anecdote. I was part of the pilot study, the 100,000 Genome Project. If you have anything to do with that, come and see me at the end, because it took me 4 years to trace my own results, and it was just like pulling teeth. It was so difficult. I got my genetic result in the end, but it shouldn't have been that hard. And I really think that I keep all of my records because I move around a lot, and I like to have access to all my blood results because I'm intelligent enough to be able to have responsibility of the information that belongs to me. And I think we do need to be a bit better about giving patients that. But there's so many different systems. Your GP's got 4 different systems, your hospital's got something different, and they don't speak to each other. We've heard this a million times, but it's going to crack at some point if people don't have control over their own data.
Yeah.
Okay. We have an interesting example from our GI product here. In some regards, you have similar types of challenges. There's a diagnostic odyssey, and then when you go into treatment, you need to monitor. What we find was if we've enabled people to do that testing themselves, they have the data, they can choose where to go with it. So they can use one of the clinicians that works for us, or they can work with our clinician. And when you think about the incentivization and the alignment, the person that has the problem is the one that's most incentivized to try and do something about it. And we find individuals that have had a very long history of uncontrolled GI issues. Once they do go into treatment, they're doing long-term monitoring, they will collect 200 breath samples because the marginal cost of measurement is 0 for them. And you can start to see in that data, oh, I'm responding to this treatment, or I have a relapse or a flare, and I need to go on to different types of treatments. So I think there's definitely an argument for enabling the user and the patient to have access to that, but with clinical oversight. So they're not trying to make decisions on their own or go off piste.
Okay, great. Okay, back on script. So we got some, let's start with you, Billy. We've got some technology. There's lots of technology out there. Technology is not usually the issue per se. It's about how that is adopted. And with our overarching theme of this panel about, let's be positive and let's look at practical issues. Practically, how do you go about getting your technology adopted, and particularly think about, when does it work rather than when it's not working? What are the lessons others could take maybe?
I think back to that previous point, there's elements of incentive and alignment there. So can we ensure that the people who are going to benefit are the ones that have access to it directly? So I do think that's a big element to it. And then also think again about some of the accessibility points as well, because again, if tests need to be used in a clinical setting, that puts pressure on the patient. They have to show up at the sites. It puts pressure on the clinics as well. So I think there's a challenge of using what we have today, but I do think there is this broader challenge of what you do from a longitudinal monitoring standpoint is a big unsolved problem. And again, the work that we do with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, looking at Pseudomonas infection, that's a big issue there. There's not a lot of tools that you can use today to try and get on top of it.
Deborah, someone knocks on your door, they got the best bit of text since sliced bread. How do you go about getting that adopted?
Yeah, I'd go back to my very first thing, which is actually just connecting systems and having so that you can input and access an IT system from anywhere and get the right data, obviously with governance or whatever is required, but be able to link IT systems that we just need in our diagnostic system into one system that works, and you have sufficient computing, sufficient storage for the masses of data we produce, and it works and it's effective, and links into all the necessary databases and other things that you need to tap on.
So do you see that as a problem for the developer of this tech? They must have the right APIs, they must be using the right communication standards, or is it an NHS issue that they just don't have necessarily compute power or whatever might be needed?
I think there is a real, dare I say it, NHS issue with computing power and IT infrastructure for sure. And I think particularly in genomics, we're going to have to recognize this as a computing strong field. And that's going to have to be improved to enable us to do better what we try to do.
I know several companies who will be happy to provide compute services to the NHS, or already do. Peter, then we're going to Lucy. Cool.
So from our side of things, the lack of adoption is a deep structural problem. Rare diseases doesn't have a natural operational home in the NHS. This is a problem that we've seen in cancers previously, and the solution was a good solution, I think, and I think something that I advocate very strongly for in rare diseases was to create the Cancer Alliance. So these were regional organizations that were set up to look after and shift the burden from the forefront of clinical practice into a operational delivery pathway that could run these more strategic programs. So that is a huge challenge to us getting anything into play on a large scale within the NHS. We worked and we've been pushed closer to the genomic meta services because they are this quasi-home of rare diseases. They're very much the genetic diagnostic endpoint, but the case finding and screening through millions of records, that doesn't have a natural home. And other programs within the NHS, moving patients around that have possibly even been diagnosed but aren't on the right treatment or in the wrong place, those type of operational problems are very difficult for the NHS that has a 7-minute GP time frame. So shifting that operationally into another group is a challenge that we've had to do. And actually, I think one of the biggest surprises as a tech developer into healthcare is you end up creating clinics. It's well known. I mean, possibly you've had to do some of the same. But we create technology. We thought we would only be the data and tech side, but we have huge part of our business dedicated to setting up operational delivery practices within the NHS. These are NHS clinicians that we've had to find funding sources to bring together. We've had to set up the legal agreements to get them intertwined with the downstream and upstream providers. It's a huge complexity that I don't think we can solve rare disease diagnosis at scale at the NHS if we don't create these operational layers.
Lucy?
So I think for years we've seen academia and clinicians work together, and that we accept that now as just part of the course. And then increasingly we've had patient involvement, and one area that I do struggle with is that patients are often involved, but they're not necessarily on the same level or treated on the same level, and they often not compensated in the same way, which really challenges those organisations, those charities, to be able to diversify what patients they're bringing forward to give their views on sort of these products or research that's going on. But I think actually we just need a much more holistic and integrated system in which tech is just it's part of the course, that there are going to be people that are involved in tech, people that are going to be involved in academia, clinicians and patients all around the table all the time. And I think if we move to a system like that, you'd bring the resource and the kind of the vitality of tech into the kind of slightly lackluster, lagging behind NHS system at the moment. I say that as a recent NHS employee myself. And I think we just need a slightly tighter system, because I don't see the NHS fundamentally changing quick enough to be able to meet the needs of patients here. But I do think we can probably, make things a bit more exciting if we took away some of the red tape and got more people around the table.
Okay, lackluster NHS.
Sorry.
That's a
I won't be
soundbite,
invited
isn't
back,
it?
will I?
Okay, thanks, Deborah. I am going to come back to you all for your one takeaway that you want people to walk out the room with. But before we go there, I'd like to turn it over to the room to see if there's any questions. Already have one back there.
Hi, thank you very much. Peter Lanyon. I'm an NHS clinician working in rare autoimmune diseases, and I'm the clinical lead for rare diseases in the National Disease Registration Service. And I have one challenge, additional challenge I'd like to pose to you, and then one question perhaps particularly for Lucy. But to pick up Peter's point that when we have a disease with a very low prevalence, even if we've got very high specificity, the number of false positives will swamp the number of people with the genuine disease. And as we raise awareness of rare disease and have more testing in primary care based on blood tests, we're seeing a real rise in the number of referrals or the number of advice and guidance requests where the pre-test probability, if you go into it in detail, is very, very low. So I wonder if the panel has any advice about how we overcome one of those challenges. And then I just want to move things slightly from data, quantitative data, to the qualitative aspects, because I guess the data only depends on the person putting the data into the system. And Lucy, picking up your comments about diagnostic odyssey, the narrative around that sometimes is that along the way there are some clinicians or healthcare professionals that help, and there are some clinicians and healthcare professionals that are seen as barriers to getting a diagnosis. And I wonder if you had any reflections on those qualitative characteristics that we can then try and work on in the NHS to support those earlier diagnostic discussions.
Great, thanks very much. Perhaps Lucy, if you want to answer that one, then I'll come to Billy and Peter to talk about that swamping of the NHS with diagnostic tests.
Thank you. My brain is a sieve. So I am overwhelmingly grateful for the role of the NHS in my life. Certainly, I wouldn't be here without it. I think I feel that so much of the PCD community's experience is down to chance. So it's so, the reason I was diagnosed, I was born in West Wales, and my family were very, my mum had been to the doctor with me so many times that she felt neurotic, so she sort of stopped going at some point. We moved to England briefly, and she took me to a doctor who just so happened to know someone who specialises in PCD. And it was told to me as this kind of tale of, chance. You found someone who knew about this rare thing. And I think that's what has to change. But I'm a bit pessimistic, I guess, in the case of rare diseases, because we have this big narrative of, collectively they're not rare. But when you get down to the actual condition, which is if we're an individual, and everybody here is patients in some way or another, they are rare, and it is down to chance. And I think we probably, I think Helen and I may touch on this a bit later in our next talk, but I think we need a better way of flagging things, and so that it's not down to an individual, it's not down to chance, that there is some kind of algorithm built in behind it all that goes, actually, this is what you need. I should not be using ChatGPT to try and work out what else my son might have if it's not PCD, but no one seems to be doing it for me. So I think we need some kind of infrastructure that takes out the human element. And I'm sorry you wanted to know about qualitative things, but I think actually it shouldn't be down to chance. And unfortunately, there are millions of hardworking NHS professionals out there, but they can't be responsible for everything.
Thanks, Lucy. And it makes you feel better. You're one of 40 million people every day who ask ChatGPT about health. Billy, Peter, thoughts on the tidal wave of diagnostics?
Yeah, no, it's a tough problem when the prevalence is low. It's a tough problem. You need to have basically near perfect tests to minimize the false positives there. Two observations I'd make is that if you're not diagnosing, you're still going to be incurring costs through that state when the patient is not diagnosed. So I think ultimately there's going to be a bit of a balance there between what Lucy was talking about earlier with test performance, accessibility, costs, etc. I think another way to approach it from the diagnostic company perspective, rare disease diagnostics is tough. It's diagnostics at the best of time is hard to get investors excited about. And I think when you look at rare diseases, it's a tough proposition as well. That's why I think we have tried to tend to focus more on post-diagnosis and monitoring, where you do have a need. There isn't a lot of tests there, but you're solving a slightly different commercial problem as well, in the sense that the person is identified already. So you're getting around it a little bit, but that's what we're kind of doing. But I know at a system level, that is an issue. You need to have near perfect tests.
Yeah, I'll try and go through this quickly because of time. But yeah, this is our major problem. We use a few things. One, we sacrifice sensitivity to try and when we're titrating to increase specificity. All of our algorithms that we deploy are 99.99% specific, but we're scanning 10 million patients, so you still get a fair deal of patients out. But we take a very careful look at the numbers, the flag rates, as we call them, the positive predictive value. I guess one thing that would really help would be a useful predictive value. In the NHS, we kind of lean on the cancer side. There's a 3% currently positive predictive value that we try and hit as at least a minimum. The other thing that we do routinely at the moment is we aggregate diseases. So now most of our algorithms that we're building at the moment are phenotype specific instead of disease specific. And why this is useful is you aggregate rare diseases together. A good example of this, about 1% of epilepsy patients may have a single gene driver. There's a good gene panel for this within the genetic testing directory. So now we're looking at epileptic patients as a starting point and then filtering them down based on other signs and symptoms. So you do get an overall predictive chance of increased predictive value by looking at a bigger group.
Yeah, good. Deborah?
Yeah, I think I'm going to take a completely different tack because we're in a conundrum, aren't we? We want to enable more people to be able to order genomic tests. We talk about mainstreaming genomics, etc. That's going to dilute our diagnostic yield, of course. But the one thing that would help is if the cost of the tests kept coming down. They have come down a lot over even the past 5 years. And I think the hope is also we should be looking at trying to develop tests that aren't quite as expensive as they currently are and that are more available to others. But as I say, it's really a chicken and egg situation. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, wow. Go on, maybe we'll avoid the sum up. We'll go for questions. Sam.
Thanks. I'm Samantha Walker from Asthma in the UK. Lucy, it's must be terribly frustrating for that delay time for PCD, but interestingly, it's the same for asthma and the same for COPD and the same for bronchiectasis, and because respiratory illnesses are really, really hard to diagnose. I think one of the things that we were really pleased to see was LifeArc did an amazing piece of work to look at what a better diagnostic test should look like for people with respiratory illnesses. So I don't think you need necessarily a diagnostic or get a diagnostic deluge if we can just find cheaper, earlier ways to know whether there's something wrong with your lungs or not right at the beginning. So at the moment, we've got no way of knowing whether you're breathless because you run up the stairs or you're breathless because you've got PCD. That's such a great piece of work, and we're very much hoping, working with LifeArc, that can be used to lower the entry level to which people actually get taken any notice of. Would be a great place to start, I think.
Okay, thanks, Sam. I've got one job as chair, and that's to keep us to time. So we'll forgo the quick wrap up, but I just want to say a big thank you to the panel for bringing their expertise to the room.